The other day, my brother Victor was over, and he was insisting that I need to check out this video that attempts to, I guess, debunk the Mr. Plinkett arguments in favor of the Star Wars prequels. And I assume this is a good video because my brother Victor has good taste. And he himself revisited the prequels after this video and came to love them. He compared it to Legend of the Galactic Heroes in how he was describing it to me. He was like, if you're not worried about like the Western sense of pacing and like those kind of structural aspects, then the film is good. And I don't need a video to tell me that, simply because these counter arguments have existed for a long time. It's just that it's really only after the new sequels came out, and particularly after the second and third new sequels came out that people really, really didn't like, that the conversation around the prequels really started to get interesting, because it became that suddenly everybody wanted to celebrate the fact that they weren't what Star Wars is now. That somehow what Lucas had tried to do, and maybe arguably failed to do because he was too ambitious, was at least more interesting than what Disney then tried to do that was arguably not so ambitious, even though it looks like it is. It looks more ambitious, but really it's more like resting on the laurels of what Star Wars is as much as possible, as you very slowly expand what Star Wars can be, while Lucas was really trying to rip open what Star Wars could be and, inject all kinds of stuff into that, which made sense because by that point also there had been all this exterior lore that, whether he acknowledged much of it or not, it had created this idea that if you still were paying attention to Star Wars, you must have thought of it as something much more expansive than what it originally was. And that's why I think he had the space to do something like that with the franchise. When we talk about the Mr. Plinkett video, though, I need to emphasize that what makes that video so great, so legendary, is not just that it's about the Star Wars prequels. It was like the first super long form analytical review on the internet. It was the first time that somebody went and did I think it was 70 minutes, 80 minutes for the first one, something like that. Just this incredibly lengthy analysis. And also the first one that ever integrated like live action footage, interviews with real people. And I have to emphasize that is by far the aspect of it that influenced me the most. I didn't give a shit about the Star Wars prequels. I've never cared about Star Wars almost at all. The only reason that Star Wars has ever impacted my life is that it is an inescapable aspect of culture, and I've always been around people who liked Star Wars. I still haven't seen the last two sequel movies. I've seen all three prequels. I've seen the original films. I think they're fine. I didn't love the prequels as a kid. I remember thinking the third one was really good, but then I really liked Plinkett's reviews, and I thought everything he said, he made great points. But it wasn't really this resentment for the films that was being catered to by these videos. It was more that it was exciting to see someone break down what makes a story memorable. In particular, I think the part where he asks everybody how they would describe Han Solo and Princess Leia versus how they would describe Qui-Gon Jinn, I think that is easily the most telling part of the whole video. That's the part where you're really meant to feel like, oh wow, you're right, the characters don't have deep personalities in the prequels. Like the main characters, they just don't feel as human and as rememberable as the original cast. That's not all that the prequels have to offer. Like, it's not that it's a fair comparison in saying, okay, so this movie's good and this movie's bad, just because of this one thing. It's just a really well-made argument. And it's one that influenced lots of people from that point forward because it gave you tools to figure out how to describe why you don't like something or you don't remember something or think it's good. And the reality is that the Plinkett review was so successful because so many people hated the prequel films. It wasn't like Plinkett said all this and then everybody suddenly hated the prequel films. They were incredibly successful and plenty of people loved them, but I have been a Boondocks fan since the comic days back in the mid 2000s, and there was an entire arc in the Boondocks in real time when The Phantom Menace was coming out, where in the lead up to the movie coming out, Huey hangs out in line with just like a Star Wars nerd, and they geek out about how excited they are about the films coming back, but also how nervous they are. And then afterwards, they're like crushed. They're mortified about it, you know? So I already knew there were people who really hated the prequels long before I ever saw the Plinkett videos, and the people who introduced me to those videos were in that category. It was my friends Neil X and Anthony C from the Brony community who had talked up these Plinkett videos because they were people who had been Star Wars fans and then hated the prequels and then felt vindicated by those videos, and then that led them towards being internet creators. I, by this point, was already deep into making My Little Pony analysis. So, like, Plinkett being an influence on me came later. And when I found out about Plinkett was when I found out that Egoraptor sequelitis, which I had already been a fan of for years, is an obvious ripoff of Mr. Plinkett's review. And YMS, who I think I had even seen the YMS Walking Dead review before I saw Mr. Plinkett's review, but then when you go back to the first YMS video, Precious, he's literally doing a Plinkett impression. Like, that was the point. And so when I did my Your Anime Sucks Sword Art Online, I also do a Plinkett impression all throughout it because I was making homage to that lineage of this idea that it went Plinkett, YMS, me, you know, in doing that specific style of what I think now would basically be considered a pack-out video. I might do another thing about another video about that, about the evolution of Things Sucks videos to pack-out videos that are sort of a newly burgeoning genre. But we'll save that for another video. There were immediately deep counter-arguments being written about the Plinkett reviews. It pissed off the hardcore Star Wars fans who love those movies. So it's not like the videos were immediately celebrated by everybody and loved. It was that they were controversial and therefore they spread like wildfire, you know, and they're funny and charismatic. And if you're somebody who's going to write off Star Wars as, you know, nerdy old shit, remember this was also like 5 years after the third prequel had already come out by the time the first review came out, and it took like several years for Plinkett to get out the reviews of the other two movies. Also keep in mind that Plinkett is negative on all three of those Star Wars prequels, but the public really wasn't that negative about the third one. When that movie came out, people more or less, I mean, there were parts of it people thought were corny and didn't like, but there were parts of it that went over really well. And, like, I think they were nowhere near as disastrous to Star Wars' reputation as The Last Jedi and the Return of whatever the fuck, the last one, the newest one they made. To me, growing up, I had always understood Star Wars as like a sprawling franchise because I had not seen the original films until after a point where I had seen some of the prequels, seen the video games, you know, seen it talked about in all these different contexts, seen books on shelves and stuff. Even if I didn't read them, I knew that there was this big expanded universe. I'd heard people talk about the expanded universe. So to me, the prequels were never like, oh, this ruined Star Wars, or this changed the face of it forever. It was just like another thing in this giant universe that I never felt I understood. It always felt too big for me as a kid. It was too old. It was too much lore, too heavy, you know, whereas I had other things like Pokemon that were brand new that appealed to me right as they came out, and I knew all the lore from the beginning. So that's why it took a lot longer for me to get into older stuff like Star Wars. And even then, it's more from like an anthropological angle of, well, these are super influential, so I want to check them out. And do I like them? Do I think they're good? Yeah, they're fine. But they're not like, they don't inspire me to want to go and check out the whole thing, you know? It's funny, my husband Bird is sort of a Star Wars fan, but really because he played the Old Republic and got really into the lore through that. And so from his perspective, that game, which collects like practically all the Star Wars lore into one place, gave him this idea that like all of that was relevant. And when the new movies made a lot of that irrelevant, that kind of broke it for him, where it was hard for him. He's like, well, I don't know how much of this is relevant to the game that I came in on, you know? And the answer seems to be not much, or it's hard to say. But yeah, I've seen countless arguments about why the prequels are good, and in recent years, a lot more of them from the cinematic lens of, again, this is better than the Disney ones, or at least it was interesting, or, you know, looking at Roger Ebert's review that was actually positive at the time. Again, the movies were not hated in their time. That was what made Plinkett's video revolutionary, is it was a voice for the haters. It's the exact same case as Sword Art Online and The Walking Dead. All of these were hugely successful franchises that Plinkett and YMS and I, who, you know, felt that because we are orbiting that culture, we are kind of forced into the position to have an opinion about it, where it's like, okay, well, I participate in film circles or TV circles or anime circles, and nobody will shut up about this thing. It's been out for years. It's massively popular, and everybody's singing its praises, and I don't like it. So I need to explain why I don't like it, and then it turns out there's a lot of people who don't like it who didn't know how to express that, so now they've got a thing. But it was never like, oh, well, now it sucks and everyone who ever liked it has to hate it now. And like with Sword Art Online, it kind of ended up getting treated that way because you had guys like Mother's Basement who just wouldn't stop laying into it, you know, like making video after video because it did really big numbers, but just trashing the show and its fans, and to the point that they were like afraid to show their face because they're going to get mocked for liking the most popular and influential fucking anime of its time. I've always had a fascination with SAO because I think it has a lot of good ideas and it's just executed horribly, and like it could be great. So I don't think its fans deserved that level of backlash. But again, when I made my video bashing SAO, there weren't any others. There was a ton of praise for it. So with Phantom Menace, sure, it's not like it was the most loved thing in the world, but there were all these people harboring this pain for like a decade up to that point that it released for them. If you have kept up with Red Letter Media since the Plinkett videos, you should understand that Mike Stoklas's taste is incredibly formalist. He is like the most formalist film fan you could possibly be. He says, I'm a structure guy all the time. His favorite movies are movies that introduce a problem. Everything is centered around that problem. You have great performances, great cast, great aesthetics, you know, cool props, handmade stuff, interesting existential fears, but a brisk pace and a overall like fun feeling, a good moral clenched, you know, victory at the end, or something that makes you feel down but like in a way that's hopeful. He's got a very specific taste, and like you could look at his movies that he considers favorites and they all fall into these same categories. He was never even a huge Star Wars fan. He's the world's biggest Star Trek fan. He had already made reviews talking about how shitty all the Star Trek movies are before he got to the Phantom Menace. So in a way, that was more of like a way of branching out from his Star Trek content than it was like sincerely being somebody who cares about Star Wars. And as time has wore on, and kind of they had the same effect that SAO had on me, where like other people went so far ahead of them carrying that baton of bitching about Star Wars that they finally went like, okay, we're not going to talk about it ever again because like we legitimately don't care, and y'all seem to, so we'll just let you have that, or we'll make fun of the fact that you care by doing stuff like the Nerd Crew, which is fucking hilarious. I wish I had done that for SAO, actually. Just like bought all of the merchandise, filled a room with it, and talked about how much I loved it. It would have been an even funnier way to keep beating that dead horse. But yeah, so I guess the point of this video is really just to really make the purpose of the Plinkett reviews in culture clear, that like they have a place as retribution for people who didn't like the prequels, particularly at the time, which was a decade hence of the film, in a period where like long form reviews and analysis just weren't like a thing. It wasn't like a commonplace occurrence on the internet. People didn't think about the fact that they could go make a long explanation of why this popular movie that they didn't like was actually not good. And when people realized they could do that, it was like, oh shit, fuck. I can complain about The Walking Dead. I can like really make you understand what's wrong with this thing that that had a strong start, but ultimately it just fell apart because of execution reasons and meddling on the production end, like usually. Anyways, this is longer than it needs to be. I hope you all appreciate the Plinkett videos for what they are, a time and place thing, very influential. But should they be considered the definitive take on the Star Wars prequels? No take should ever be considered the definitive take on anything. There should always be as many takes as possible. If anything, every time something comes out that feels definitive, that should be the most inspiring towards other people to find like a counter, like to find a way to prove that it's not, Anyway. Trixie forever. Thanks for watching.